In neighborhoods across America, the laughter of children is often considered a symbol of innocence. Teenagers, though sometimes reckless, are usually seen as kids still figuring out who they are. But every so often, a case breaks into the headlines that shatters this perception. A violent crime committed not by hardened adults, but by children barely into their teens. These cases strike deep because they raise a question society struggles to answer. How young is too young to take a life? And if a child kills, what punishment could ever be enough? A crime that shook a town. In 1993, two 10-year-old boys in Liverpool, England, abducted and murdered 2-year-old James Bulger. The crime horrified the world. These weren't grown men hardened by years of violence. They were children who should have been in school. Though this case happened outside the United States, it became an international symbol of how young is too young when it comes to serious punishment. Closer to home, America has seen its share of shocking juvenile crimes. 13 and 14-year-olds committing murders that seemed calculated and brutal. Communities rocked by these events often demanded maximum punishment. In some cases, prosecutors pushed for life sentences, sometimes even without parole. Society's dilemma. When a teenager commits murder, the justice system faces a unique crisis. On one hand, the crime is as devastating as any adult's. Lives are lost, families are destroyed, and communities are forever changed. On the other hand, the perpetrator is a minor. Someone whose brain, science tells us, is still developing, especially the parts linked to judgment and impulse control. Should society treat them as adults to ensure justice? Or should it recognize their capacity for change and treat them as children who made catastrophic mistakes? The rise of juvenile life sentences. Beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, during a wave of public fear over so-called superpredators, courts across the United States began trying more juveniles as adults. By the 2000s, thousands of teenagers were serving life sentences in adult prisons. Some were as young as 14 at the time of their crimes. Critics argue this strips away hope of rehabilitation, leaving children condemned to die in prison. Supporters counter that murder is murder, regardless of age, and that justice demands accountability. The debate begins the stage for the core conflict of this story: whether juvenile life sentences represent justice served or justice denied. As we move forward, we'll look at the lives behind these headlines. The victims, the families, the young offenders, and the society forced to wrestle with the chilling reality of kids who kill. The courtroom is supposed to be a place of justice, but when the accused is a child, the atmosphere changes. Judges, jurors, and even reporters struggle with the same haunting question. Should this young face be judged as a criminal or as a kid who lost their way? The weight of the charge. When prosecutors bring charges against juvenile defendants accused of murder, their first major decision is whether to try them as juveniles or adults. This single choice can mean the difference between a sentence that ends at 21 or one that lasts a lifetime. Prosecutors often argue that the crime, not the age, should determine punishment. They describe the brutality of the act in detail, urging the court to see past the defendant's youth. If you're old enough to take a life, they say, you're old enough to face adult consequences. Defense attorneys, however, fight back just as fiercely. They argue that children are not fully developed, either emotionally or mentally, and should never be punished as if they were adults. They remind the jury that teenagers are impulsive, easily influenced, and often lack the foresight to understand the weight of their actions. The emotional tension. Courtrooms become emotional battlegrounds in these cases. On one side sit the grieving families of victims, who want justice and closure. Many find it impossible to forgive a child who committed such a violent act, insisting that age should not reduce accountability. On the other side sit the families of the defendants, often in shock themselves. Parents describe their children as loving, funny, and misunderstood, unable to reconcile the kid they raised with the crime they're accused of. The tension is unbearable. Two families, both destroyed, facing each other in the same room, united only by grief and divided by justice. A judge's burden. Judges who preside over these cases often express the difficulty of their role. Sentencing a teenager to life in prison without parole is one of the most severe punishments in the American justice system. Some judges admit that it feels like condemning a child to die slowly, behind bars, for mistakes made before they were even fully grown. Yet when the crime is brutal enough, their hands feel tied. Public pressure, community outrage, and the permanent loss of life weigh heavily against the chance of rehabilitation. Case Spotlight. In 1999, Nathaniel Abraham, a 13-year-old from Michigan, was tried as an adult for murder after fatally shooting a stranger. Though his defense argued he was too young to understand the consequences of his actions, prosecutors painted him as a dangerous threat to society. His case became a national symbol of the debate: justice for the victim or mercy for the offender. The larger battle. Courtrooms become the stage for a larger cultural fight. Should the justice system lean toward punishment, ensuring victims' families see justice served? Or should it lean toward rehabilitation, giving young offenders a chance at redemption? These questions, played out in real trials, have shaped laws, policies, and public opinion for decades. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. For most teenagers, growing up means learning to drive, graduating from high school, or making plans for the future. For juveniles sentenced to life, growing up means adapting to a world of steel doors, concrete walls, and constant surveillance. Their adulthood is forged inside prison yards, not classrooms. The first days inside. When a 14 or 15-year-old enters an adult prison, the shock is immediate. The rules are strict, the environment harsh, and survival becomes the first priority. Many juvenile lifers recall feeling terrified, suddenly surrounded by seasoned criminals decades older than them. Some are placed in solitary confinement for their protection, spending months or even years in isolation. While intended to keep them safe, these conditions often cause severe psychological damage, depression, anxiety, and in some cases, suicidal thoughts. The struggle to mature. A teenager's brain is still developing, but in prison, the process is warped. Instead of learning responsibility through school, work, and relationships, they learn survival, how to navigate prison politics, avoid conflict, or align themselves with groups for protection. Some embrace education programs, earning GEDs or even college degrees. Others fall into gangs, violence, and disciplinary trouble, reinforcing the belief that they cannot be rehabilitated. A few find mentors, older inmates or chaplains, who help guide them toward reflection and growth. Every path looks different, but each carries the weight of knowing that, no matter how much they change, their sentence might never allow them freedom. Emotional and psychological toll. Growing up in prison often means growing up with guilt. Many juvenile lifers express remorse as they age, saying they didn't truly understand the permanence of death when they took a life. Some describe nightmares of their crimes, or the crushing weight of realizing that one moment of violence erased any hope of a normal future. For others, the years harden them. After decades behind bars, some become resigned, losing all hope of release. Rehabilitation becomes meaningless if freedom will never come. Case Spotlight. Consider the case of Lionel Tate, who at age 12 was sentenced to life in prison without parole for killing a 6-year-old girl during what he claimed was a wrestling move gone wrong. Though his conviction was eventually overturned, his years behind bars highlighted the larger question. What does it mean for a child to grow up inside a prison system built for adults? Society's perception. To the outside world, many of these inmates are invisible. Their names fade from headlines, but their lives continue behind walls. They serve their sentences quietly, unseen, as debates rage on the outside about whether they should ever be given another chance. By the mid-2000s, the United States had more juveniles serving life without parole than any other country in the world. Human rights groups called it a violation of international law. Families of victims called it justice. The debate reached the nation's highest courts, where lawyers and lawmakers began to ask, is condemning a child to die in prison truly constitutional? Supreme Court interventions. Over the past 2 decades, the Supreme Court has issued several landmark decisions that reshaped juvenile sentencing. Roper v. Simmons, 2005, the court ruled it unconstitutional to execute offenders who were under 18 when their crimes were committed. Graham v. Florida, 2010, the court struck down life without parole for juveniles convicted of non-homicide offenses. Miller v. Alabama, 2012, the court declared mandatory life without parole for juvenile homicide offenders unconstitutional, requiring judges to consider age and circumstances before sentencing. Montgomery versus Louisiana, 2016, this ruling made Miller retroactive, giving thousands of juvenile lifers a chance at resentencing. These cases didn't end juvenile life sentences entirely, but they cracked open the door for reform and second chances. Voices of change. Reform advocates argue that children are fundamentally different from adults. They point to brain science proving that teenagers are more impulsive, more easily influenced, and less capable of long-term thinking. With time, support, and rehabilitation, many believe these young offenders can transform. Nonprofits, church groups, and legal clinics have taken up their cases, fighting to have sentences reduced or parole granted. They argue not for excusing crimes, but for recognizing the human potential for growth. Resistance and outrage, but not everyone supports reform. For victims' families, every new court ruling can feel like another wound. They argue that giving killers a chance at release ignores the permanent loss of their loved ones. Communities, too, often fear the return of someone who once committed such violent acts. In some states, prosecutors still push aggressively for life sentences, insisting that certain crimes are simply too brutal to merit leniency, no matter the age of the offender. Case spotlight: Henry Montgomery, the man at the center of Montgomery versus Louisiana, was sentenced to life in prison at age 17 for killing a deputy sheriff in 1963. For over 50 years, he lived behind bars before finally being released in 2021 at the age of 75. His case embodied both sides of the debate. To some, he represented hope and rehabilitation. To others, his release felt like injustice delayed. A shifting landscape. Today, juvenile life sentences are increasingly rare, but not gone. State laws vary widely. Some have abolished them entirely, while others continue to allow them in the worst cases. The fight is far from over, and each case continues to test the balance between justice, mercy, and the value of human change. The question of whether a teenager can ever be too young to deserve life in prison is one that cuts to the very core of justice in America. By the end of this story, one truth remains clear. There is no easy answer: the human cost. For victims' families, juvenile life without parole often feels like the only fair sentence. Their loved ones will never get a second chance at life, so why should the person who took it? Each parole hearing can reopen old wounds, forcing them to relive their pain. For the juvenile serving life, the punishment is a sentence of death in slow motion. Years ticking away behind bars for actions they committed when their minds were still developing. Some reformers argue this is a punishment that ignores science, growth, and the possibility of redemption. Stories of change. In states where resentencing has taken place, some juvenile lifers have walked free after decades behind bars. Many went on to become community leaders, mentors, and advocates for at-risk youth, living proof, reformers say, that teenagers are capable of profound transformation. Others, however, return to crime, reigniting the public's fears that leniency only risks more tragedy. Society's dilemma. At its heart, the debate forces us to ask, should justice prioritize punishment or rehabilitation? Can society accept that a 15 or 16-year-old who committed an unthinkable act might one day walk free? Or do some crimes, no matter the age of the offender, demand permanent consequences? A nation at a crossroads. Today, the United States remains one of the only countries in the world to still impose life without parole on juveniles. Yet with every court ruling, every parole decision, and every victim's voice, the country edges closer to choosing what kind of justice system it truly wants. Is it a system rooted in retribution, ensuring the worst crimes are met with the harshest punishments? Or one that believes even the most broken young lives can be rebuilt? Final reflection. The debate over juvenile life sentences is not just about the crimes of the past. It is about the future of justice itself. Whether you see these young offenders as irredeemable killers or as children who made irreversible mistakes, the question remains: should a teenager ever be sentenced to die in prison, or should every child, no matter their crime, be given a chance at redemption?